Welcome to the ongoing series in which I attempt to work through the entire original Game Boy library, 3 games at a time. In each episode, I'll talk about one game that I like and one game that I don't. And finally, a third mystery game that could be bad or it could be good. All I can say for sure is that it will certainly be Game Boy. This is the good, the bad, and the Game Boy. In the early 80s, adults in America sent a clear message to the world that they were simply not interested in video games. And we refer to this declaration as the video game crash. However, if history has taught us anything, is that it was these people specifically, the baby boomers I guess, who were the problem all along, not video games as a whole. Nintendo has presented these same people with multiple opportunities to change their minds, most famously with the Wii in the mid-2000s. But there was a previous attempt made in 1989, which is why, the story goes, the Game Boy shipped with Tetris instead of Super Mario Land. I would also say this is why the Game Boy's library could be neatly divided into 2 categories of games. On one side, you had portable versions of the same games and franchises that were popular on the full-size Nintendo Entertainment System.
For the kids.
On the other side were the games that were meant to appeal to everyone, kids and adults alike, and were arguably better suited for the more casual, anytime, anywhere experience of a handheld gaming system. Essentially just time killers, these games are meant to be simple and immediately engaging, infinitely playable and infinitely replayable, and aren't intended to be necessarily beaten or completed so much as fit into whatever amount of idle time you have available, whether it's just a few minutes on the bus, or hours and hours on the couch. The 3 games I'm talking about today are from 3 completely different genres, and none of them are puzzle games like Tetris. But one thing they all have in common is that I would categorize them all as time-killing games with universal appeal. If you had to describe Motocross Maniacs as succinctly as possible, I suppose the easiest way to do that would be to say, it's like Excitebike on the Game Boy. But the broad strokes method doesn't properly convey the fact that there's a lot more going on in Konami's motorcycle racing game than Nintendo's. With more tracks to race on, deeper, more skill-based bike mechanics, hidden secrets, and a power-up system, Motocross Maniacs is a far more complete and rewarding experience, making Excitebike seem as quaint and primitive as a Game & Watch game by comparison. Motocross Maniacs presents you with 8 tracks of increasing complexity, any of which can be chosen from the start of the game, as well as one of 3 difficulty modes. The controls are simple enough that you can get through the first couple tracks without too much trouble, but by the 3rd or 4th track, you'll definitely need to become quite familiar with the finer details of how your bike controls. Since the majority of the tracks are magically floating structures in the air, taking your bike off sweet jumps is a big part of the game. Holding up while going over ramps will let you jump farther. You'll need to properly angle your bike to avoid crashing when you hit the ground.
You got like 3 feet of air that time.
You start each race with a small number of nitrous boost canisters, which give you a quick little burst of speed and let you go flying over jumps. Boost jumping very quickly becomes mandatory for staying on the track, and you can pick up additional canisters at designated points during the race, simply represented as the letter N. The letter S will increase your bike's overall speed. The R power-up will increase your tires, I'm not really sure exactly what that does for you. And finally, the letter T will add more time to the clock. If you crash at any time, you lose all the power-ups you've collected, although the game is nice enough to let you hang on to any nitrous canisters that you have in your inventory. If you're in the air long enough, you can execute front and back flips by holding left or right on the D-pad. By flipping at specific spots, you can uncover secret items, like up to 3 of these little mini bikes that trail along behind you, and the awesome jet power-up that lets you use your nitrous boost in the air. If you have enough boosts saved up, you can essentially fly over the track to skip over obstacles or even find secret items high in the air. In addition to the standard single-player mode, there's also a versus computer mode, which puts a computer-controlled shadow motorcycle on the track with you. You aren't really racing the computer though. The conditions for winning each race are identical to that of the solo mode, so it doesn't matter whether or not you actually beat the computer to the finish line. You can race a human opponent in the 2-player mode, which I imagine would be a lot of fun, but it requires 2 Game Boys, 2 copies of the game, and 2 people who are interested in playing Motocross Maniacs. As such, I've never been able to try this mode out. Motocross Maniacs is one of those rare games that captured my attention in spite of my tepid interest in the game's subject matter. With its focus on properly executed jumping and its bevy of power-ups and secret items, it often feels as much like a fast-paced platformer as it does a racing game. And the depth of its controls and the complexity of its tracks means that completing each race, especially on the higher difficulty levels, relies more on skill than twitch reflexes. Most importantly, it's just fun. The simple but charming graphics work extremely well on the tiny Game Boy screen, and the gameplay is perfect for both short and long-term gaming sessions. It's deep and addictive enough to hold your interest for hours, while at the same time being fast and simple enough that you can squeeze in just a few races on the bus, in line at the DMV, or, well, anywhere. Tasmania's story is based on a Japanese film from 1990. Everything I know about the movie comes from the game's instruction manual, which devotes a full page to explaining the story. Assuming this is a synopsis of the movie, it would seem that the film is kind of a drama, which is right away an odd choice for a video game tie-in. There's a father attempting to bond with his estranged son, there's some environmental messaging going on that was a popular topic at the time, and there's also a bit of intrigue with the implication that the Tasmanian tiger might not actually be extinct after all. I'm not sure if the movie actually answers this question or not, but ultimately it's a moot point, because as I'm about to show you, this elaborate backstory is completely pointless. Now, I bought this game in April of 2013, and it was right around that time that I played it for the first time. Based on that experience, I thought it highly unlikely that I'd ever find another Game Boy game that I liked less than Tasmania's Story. Tasmania's Story is a single-screen action game along the lines of Pac-Man, where you complete each board by collecting all the plants on the screen, while avoiding contact with these 4 enemy creatures following you around. The manual says these guys are Tasmanian devils.
Right.
You can't completely destroy these creatures, but you can temporarily stun them by either dropping on them from above or setting a bomb in their path. You can reach the upper levels of the stage by jumping on these trampolines on either side of the screen, similar to Mappy if you've ever played that. After stunning a set number of enemies, that board's bonus animal will briefly appear on the screen. Fitting with the game's Down Under theme, these are all distinctly Australian animals like koalas, wombats, kangaroos, and everyone's favorite Australian animal, penguins. And if you manage to get there in time, you'll be awarded bonus points. After 20,000 points, you'll get an extra life. And the game goes on this way for 10 screens, and then it loops. Now there's something about Tasmania's Story that I really need to get off my chest, and some of the more eagle-eyed viewers in the audience may have already noticed this. The game looks like absolute shit. This is without a doubt the worst looking game that I've ever seen on the Game Boy. I know the graphics aren't everything, gameplay is ultimately what matters most. However, it would have been easier to overlook the ugly and primitive graphics if the game were remotely fun or interesting to play. But the problem is, it's not. The game controls decently enough, although the quirky collision detection definitely takes some getting used to. But there's very little actual game in Tasmania's Story. There's no real sense of escalating challenge. From one board to the next, there's no discernible change in enemy behavior or speed. The plants and bonus animals change on every board, but that's a pretty poor excuse for variety in a game that honestly would have been far more appropriate as a Tiger handheld game. Hey guys, it's me real quick. Before I move on to the third and final game, I guess I'm just not done bagging on Tasmania's Story just yet. Because even after I was done with this section, I had recorded the audio and the gameplay and I had finished editing this section, I could never really get it out of my head that the game manual had talked about Mike's search for the Tasmanian tiger, and yet the game never actually resolved that. And that seemed like kind of a weird thing for the game not to address in some way, so on a hunch, I went back and I replayed the game, and I made a point to rescue all 10 animals on all 10 boards. And lo and behold, that's the key to opening up the true final ending to the game. That's what we're looking at right here. So I just wanted to say that I was wrong. I thought this game just kind of looped infinitely. It does not. And I gotta say, it's somehow more offensive to me that the game just ends after 10 screens than it did if it had just repeated this thin gameplay indefinitely. Keep in mind that even if this was a discount game back in the day, it still probably cost kids back then $15 to $20. Imagine spending $15 of your allowance money on a game that you could literally see the ending to in about 8 minutes. That's ridiculous. So here's my question to you viewers at home. What is the worst Game Boy game that you have ever played? I honestly want to know, because I want to know how it compares to Tasmania's Story. It's strange to think that there was a time when HAL Laboratory wasn't exclusively focused on the Kirby series, but they actually used to develop a variety of games from almost every genre imaginable. One of the earliest games they developed for the Game Boy was Revenge of the Gator, a game that I've always been aware of but never really had much interest in trying out, as I generally find pinball games even less appealing than racing games. Now right away, Revenge of the Gator makes a great first impression, immediately displaying all the charm and personality that I would expect from the developer who would later start cranking out the excruciatingly adorable and charismatic Kirby series. Now HAL leans hard into the alligator motif, from the troupe of dancing gators that perform at the title screen to, of course, the pinball table itself. There's only one table in the game, but it is a pretty large playing field, taking up 4 screens as well as a few additional bonus screens. Every section of the table is filled with alligators, all of which are interactive in some way. The ball physics definitely aren't perfect, but they are convincing enough that they aren't game-breaking by any means, which is probably about as good as you could expect on the Game Boy. The ball itself handles with a pretty believable amount of weight, but there's no hiding the fact that the Game Boy is utterly incapable of reproducing the feel of a physical ball slamming around a physical table. No matter how aggressively you smash the buttons, those little 8-bit flippers aren't going to slap the ball any harder. Now obviously one of the biggest advantages of digital pinball games like this is that it allows the developers to add in features and mechanics that just would not be possible on an actual pinball table. And yeah, there's a little bit of that here, but outside of a few sequences where the game basically turns into Breakout for a little bit, there isn't really much here that I haven't seen on an actual pinball table. And while you might say that this is indication that maybe HAL didn't go hard enough on the alligator theme, I'm going to be more charitable and say that I actually appreciate the lack of video game gimmicks, because it provides a clean and relatively uncluttered experience that still delivers engaging gameplay. And of course, drips with personality. There's just one problem. Regardless of how much about Revenge of the Gator I liked, I still don't especially like pinball games, and I'm even less fond of fake pinball games. Of course, I knew this going into the game. I was still kind of hoping that maybe the game would win me over in spite of this, but you know, it didn't. It often seemed that I was completely at the mercy of the game's artificial physics and the ball being predetermined to follow set routes. Trying to meet the conditions on each screen to advance to the next section was actually really frustrating. It was extremely difficult to launch the ball into the pathways to the upper screens, whereas it was of course very easy for the ball to make unlikely ricochet shots into the channels that led to the lower sections, and more often than not, directly into the mouth of the hungry alligator at the base of the table. And as I said earlier, there's only one table. Granted, it's a pretty big table, but there's only so many times you could bounce around the same 4 screens and listen to the same short music loop before familiarity just dulls the entire experience. Still, as frustrated as I got, I found myself constantly saying, just one more time, which is a testament to how fun and addictive the game can be in spite of its flaws. But remember that the question I'm attempting to answer with all these videos is not whether a game is good or not, but rather, do I like the game or not? And in this case, despite the fact that I can clearly tell Revenge of the Gator is a well-made game, I just can't give it my personal stamp of approval. But take that with a grain of salt. And that's 3 more games down, and still many, many more to go. In the next episode, we'll look at 3 more games, but in the meantime, thank you for watching The Good, The Bad, and the Game Boy.